I'm Carol Gluck, and I'm the faculty here. I teach Japanese history, and this is a little bit of what I teach. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Perry and his gunships steamed into Edo Bay to open Japan to trade. His black ships, as Japanese all know them, were meant to be menacing, which they were. Japan had existed in self-imposed isolation, seclusion from most of the world for 250 years. But now, the mythic American frontier had crossed the Pacific to meet the mythic closed-off country, demanding that Japan, that double-bolted land, as Melville called it in Moby Dick, open itself to the west. The Japanese government, the shogun and his officials, unable to meet what for them was a shocking demand, signed a series of unequal treaties with the United States and 4 other Western powers. Within 15 years, the shogunate had fallen, after 250 years, and the 1868 Meiji Restoration established a new imperial state, which ushered in a very rapid modernization as Japan marched along the path toward wealth and power. Well, does this capsule history sound as if it might be the stuff of a Broadway musical? Not likely. Unless you are John Weidman, who wrote the book, Stephen Sondheim, who wrote the lyrics and the music, and Harold Prince, who directed Pacific Overtures when it first appeared in 1976. 1976 was the year of the bicentennial. It was also the year that one of the best-selling novels was Shogun by James Clavell. And it was the year of Chorus Line on the Broadway stage. But Pacific Overtures brought this capsule history to the musical stage as brilliantly as any history has ever been brought, I believe. Pacific Overtures is now currently in revival at the Classic Stage Company, directed by John Doyle. And what I think, in my opinion, I've seen 5 versions, including the original in 1976. I think it's the best one. I think it's the best because I think it captures the essence of the play. And it's on the occasion of this revival that we are delighted today to have this panel with us. I'll introduce them to you, and I will pretend as if they do need an introduction, even if they don't. So George Takei, who is an actor, an activist, and an exemplary citizen, and you know him, I think, for his founding role in the TV series Star Trek in the 1960s, where he played Sulu, the helmsman of the Starship Enterprise. George has had a very long career in the theater and in film and television, including a 2015 Broadway debut in Allegiance, which is a musical inspired by his own family's experience of internment as Japanese Americans during World War II. And now George Takei is playing the reciter in this revival of Pacific Overtures, bestowing, as the reviews say, and these are all quotes, a stately presence, an evocative voice, and a statesmanlike dignity on the all-important narrator of the story. George has also been an activist on behalf of Japanese American internees, former internees. Take a look at his op-ed last weekend, April 30th, Saturday in the New York Times, where he warns us what can happen again when ethnic hatred prevails over constitutional rights. He played a major role in the establishment and operation of the National Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles. He's fought for social justice, for LGBTQ rights, and for marriage equality. He's also an exemplary citizen, taken on many civic roles. I first met him when he was a member of the U.S.-Japan Friendship Commission appointed by President Clinton, and as I told him a minute ago, everything that's gone right in U.S.-Japanese relations is because of us, and everything that's gone wrong is because of the administrations. George never fears or fails to speak out. And now I hope he will tell us how the reciter sees this story. This is the story that initiated Japanese-American relations. A forcible, coercive act that opened Japan to the world in 1853. And next to George is John Weidman, long now a masterful theatrical writer and librettist. He has been those things, plus also a legal advocate for the theater for more than 40 years. He collaborated with Stephen Sondheim on 3 musicals, Pacific Overtures, when I think he may have been 12 or 13, Assassins, and Bounce, which was a show that had several names. With choreographer and director Susan Stroman, John created the Tony Award-winning musical Contact, and that was in 1999. He recently wrote the book for Arrabal, which is a dance theater piece with tango about an Argentinian woman's quest to understand her country's dirty war. It's currently running or just opening?
It's in tech rehearsals.
It's in tech rehearsals.
Which is where I should be, but I'm happy to be here instead.
Tech rehearsals at the American Repertory Theater, ART, in Cambridge, and thank you for being here when they're supposed to be there helping. And opens when?
First performance is Friday. It opens officially the end of next week.
Great. That's Arrabal. John has been nominated 3 times for the Tony Award for the Best Book of a Musical, and 3 of the shows for which he's written have won Tonys. From 1999 to 2009, that's 10 years, he was president of the Dramatists Guild of America, and he was an advocate for the intellectual property rights of theatrical creators. John majored in East Asian Studies at Harvard. This was the original room of East Asian Studies at Columbia.
Really?
Yes, in 1940-something, and the library was up there. And that's why there's still Asian art in the...
And it all fit in this room?
It all fit in this room.
Yeah.
Donald King, Theodore DeBarry, all those people.
Yeah.
Goodrich, Alice, everybody you know, fit in this room. So he graduated from East Asian Studies, where he got the idea for this play. Maybe that's why the history in it is so terrific. And he graduated also from Yale Law School, but didn't practice law. Instead, he went into the theater. He's also taught elementary school, edited the National Lampoon, and written material for Sesame Street. And it was his first Broadway collaboration with Hal Prince and Stephen Sondheim that resulted in the Pacific Overtures in 1976. The show won the New York Drama Critics Prize for the Best New Musical, and it garnered 10 Tony nominations, among them 1 for John Weidman's book. And now today we'll be able to hear how John managed this transformation of history into compelling musical theater and how he feels about the current revival. And next to John is David Hajdu, who is a writer, music critic, and faculty member at the School of Journalism here at Columbia. He is now a music critic for The Nation, and before that he was music critic for more than a decade for the New Republic. He's currently, and this is interesting in connection to today, he's currently at work on a fictional work of nonfiction. Is that right? A biography of a non-existent songwriter. Now this is important because today we're talking about history becoming musical theater. Here we have another transposition, if you like, of fiction and nonfiction. It's another example of blurring these boundaries. He's also completing the libretto for a music performance piece about Orson Welles. He's the author of 4 books of nonfiction and a collection of essays, including a biography of Billy Strayhorn, a collective biography of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and their relevant others, and books on comics and on pop music. 3 of his books have been finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award and have won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. In recent years, David has been increasingly active as a songwriter and librettist for concert music. He co-conceived the 2015 concept album, Dottie's Charms, with music by Jill Sobul and words by him, Jonathan Lethem, Luke Sante, and others. The first album dedicated to songs with his lyrics is called Waiting for the Angel and was released in 2015. We look forward to hearing from David what he has to say about the music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. So with those lengthy introductions, I would be honored to ask George Takei to tell us how he sees Pacific Overtures.
Well, like you, I am a lover of Pacific unlike you, I have not seen 5 versions, only 3. I first saw the original in 1976 on Broadway. I flew all the way in from Los Angeles because I had friends in it, and they told me that it's an all Asian cast, which is a rarity in American theater, and that it's done kabuki style. My husband and I, Brad, have seen kabuki in Tokyo, and it is electrifying theater, bigger than life theater, spectacular theater. And so we wanted to see that as well. And it's Stephen Sondheim. So what a tremendous contribution to American theater. And directed by Hal Prince, to top it all off. And we got here, and my friends were wonderful in it. Ernie Harada as the madam in Welcome to Kanagawa. Alvin Ing in the number that became my favorite, Chrysanthemum Tea.
Oh dear.
I knew I was going to say that.
I love that number. Yes, it goes on, and it really slows down the storytelling, but it really gives you an idea of the indecisiveness, the pusillanimous decision-making of the shogunate. And I love that number. And my friend played the shogun's mother, and he was terrific in it. It was done, and my friend Mako was doing the reciter's role. And so I fell in love with the production right then and there. It was spectacularly done. It was the second time I saw it was in Los Angeles, done by the East-West Players, the oldest continuously operating minority theater in the United States, not just in California, but in the United States. So that's a remarkable achievement. It was founded in 1965 when I was working on Star Trek, so I don't count myself amongst the founder there, but it was a fantastic idea of producing Asian American theater, or Asian American theater, employing Asian Americans, or if there were Asians in Los Angeles that qualified. So it was an Asian American theater, and it was a long, hard struggle to keep it alive, but it's still there. And next spring, it's going to be reviving the musical that we did on Broadway, Allegiance, opening in February there. But the East-West Players did the next production I saw, and it was fantastic. I thought in many ways it surpassed Harold Prince's. It was directed by the artistic director of the East-West Players at that time, Tim Dagg, and it was wonderfully done. And Ernie Harada was the madam, and Alvin Ing was the shogun's mother. They were terrific in that. An actor named Keone Young played the reciter, and he was terrific. Where it was different from Mako's was, Mako is from Japan, and he has a Japanese accent to his speech, which I thought would be wonderful because he's a kabuki reciter, reciting in English, and the Japanese accent would have been appropriate. But Mako, I think, made an effort to sound American. He had those R's very strong, the American R's, and remote became remote, very Japanese. Whereas Keone did English with a Japanese accent, which was so perfect for that kabuki format. And then the next one I saw was the Roundabout Theater Company Revival, which was wonderful too, but I still think that the East-West Players version was the best I've ever seen. Then last year, after Allegiance this run. I saw in the New York Times, in the Arts Briefly section, that John Doyle was becoming the artistic director of the Classic Stage Company, and that he was planning on doing Pacific Overtures. I immediately called my agent and had him look into my possibility with this production. And he called back shortly and said, John Doyle is interested in you for the reciter. I was so excited by that, to be working with John Doyle, this legendary director who reimagines everything he does. His signature is to give it his singular John Doyle stamp of reimagining any play that he's going to be doing to its essential, and then building up and adding his poetry, his creative genius to it. And so I was excited to be working with John Doyle. And then when we began rehearsals, to be working with that company, the very gifted group of actors that I'm working with every night, 7 performances a week, 8 performances. It's eight performances a week, twice on Saturdays.
Don't miss one, George.
No, I won't. Particularly when you can say lines like, the languorous whisper of a geisha. I hear. The rice merchandise? Sure. Just a piece of gossip. I mean, the words that he gives an actor to speak, just delicious. So much fun to do. And so we began rehearsals, and one makes discoveries with every project, but I made another unique kind of personal discovery. You know, when you're a teenager and you discover that your voice is changing and there's nothing you can do about it. But while rehearsing, I celebrated my landmark birthday. I'm now an octogenarian. And maybe it was my consciousness of that, but I found I had to work harder and longer to retain lines, the old memory. I'd begun working on the lines since last year with Brad running lines, and I kept going up, and it was and my voice was changing too. It was no longer my voice that I'm used to hearing. But then you finally reach that point of acceptance and you go with it. But by now, it's all there. And I love the wonderful words that we have. And to be telling this story that I knew something about. My father had piqued my curiosity as a teenager, but I also remembered they had a picture book in the house. Kodansha no Ehon, you might be familiar with it, about the man that was called the Last Samurai, Saigo Takamori. And it was about the ending of the shogunate and the coming of the Meiji period, the revolutionary period in Japan. And so here was an opportunity to again refresh my memory from those days and to get to know it even more. And what piqued my curiosity even more was doing a little research on John here. He's a kid that grew up in Connecticut, and you were studying something else.
What happened? Yes.
And you were required to forcibly take East Asian studies.
Well, I did it voluntarily.
Oh, was it voluntary?
I mean, I was required to. I had arrived at Harvard as a history, intending to major in history, modern European history, but there was a distribution requirement. You had to take at least one course outside your area specialization. And without thinking about it much, I took the survey course in East Asian history. And I mean, that decision is what has put my rear end in this chair in a highly improbable fashion, but that's where it started.
What was it about that period of Japan that interested you so much?
Well,
I mean, an esoteric period.
It was. I mean, I had been one of the best high schools in the city, and I had one of the best. I had taken the walk through all the history courses, which I was required to take. But until I stepped into this classroom at Harvard for this survey course, John Keith Fairbank taught the Chinese part, and Albert Craig taught the Japanese part. I hadn't realized that half the world had been left out of my high school education, that there had been no references to Asia of any kind except in a glancing way when it was about the Boxer Rebellion or about the Second World War, and this whole half of the world sort of opened up in front of me. And I had been, my knowledge of things Japanese was enormously thin, but everybody's was. I mean, when I say everybody, I'm talking about white American upper middle class men. I've been to a couple of Kurosawa movies. I've seen Yojimbo, I think 3 times, because that's, you can't see it enough. But I suddenly, I found myself dropped into this pool of knowledge that I found exhilarating. And the focus on modern Japan really was a result of, I was astonished at the difference, as I remember it, between the way in which the Chinese responded to the arrival of the West and the way in which the Japanese did. And there was a muscularity, an organized approach to what we do next in Japan that I found fascinating. So it really was from the Meiji Restoration forward was the period of Japanese history that I found most compelling. And that's, in a sense, where ultimately where the show came from.
And the song Next.
And the song Next.
That song is so relevant to our times today now.
Yeah.
Why don't you say a little bit about Next so people know that what's in it?
Well, the arc of the show really begins with rumors that there are American ships on the way to Japan. The ships arrive. The Japanese deal with them as best they can. The show then leaps forward and sort of walks us through the next 15 years of Japanese history until the shogunate is overthrown and the emperor is restored. It then leaps into a less specific place with a closing number which has a kind of an unspecific, very poetic lyric, and it simply, though it's not simply, it's a Steve Sondheim song, but it reiterates the notion of next, what's coming next, what are we leaving behind, the excitement of wondering what's happening next, which on the one hand has a kind of a thrill and an exhilaration to it, but on the other hand it has a kind of a menacing drive, depending on how you approach the song and how you approach the idea. And in this production, in conversation with, John Doyle's instinct was to push it towards the second idea rather than the first. And I think it makes for the right ending for this show in 2017, given the world outside the theater in which it's being performed. But that's what the number is.
And it's very, very relevant to our times today. We talk about it's the end of the world when Commodore Perry comes.
Right.
But then there's something beyond end of the world, and we're now talking about
the end of the
nuclear
world.
power again, and this erratic dictator, and what's going to happen
You
next.
mean North Korea, right?
I mean North
I
Korea.
got confused.
And we seem to be retrogressing
Well, I think
rather than moving forward.
I do think that these things happen. Theater is always, the impact of any piece, you start with Shakespeare, it depends on the period of time in which it's performed, and the meaning of the piece is affected, hopefully, by that context, and I think that has happened with this show at this time.
Yeah.
That's something I'd like to go on with, but maybe I'd like to ask all of you who do know the earlier versions, how the meaning has changed. And we can include in that Miyamoto Amon's production from 2000, 2002, because that was, again, a different time. And I think you're absolutely right about that. But before we do, let me just ask George, what is your view of, you knew the story about Cycle Back Morning when you were young, but what is your view of the Japanese-American relationship at its beginning once you have acted in this play as a reciter? What's your reaction to this story?
As a Japanese American?
No, well, as you, to the Japanese-American relationship, to the history
of Japan, U.S. relationship.
Yeah.
Well, what's fascinating is Japan was a closed-off world. Foreigners couldn't enter, and Japanese couldn't leave. And it was something of that mentality that's coming back to us again today. Building a wall, banning totally and completely people of a certain faith. And Japanese Americans were seen in that context when the Second World War broke out. We happened to look like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. And so with no due process, with no charges, with no trial, we were summarily rounded up simply because of our ancestry. My grandparents were the ones that was the immigrant generation. My mother was born in Sacramento, California. My father was born in Japan, but as a young boy, he was brought over to San Francisco and grew up educated and reared in San Francisco. And he fancied himself a San Franciscan. And we were born in, my brother and sister and I were born in Los Angeles, and yet we were seen as potential enemy. And now we see people of a certain faith as potential terrorists, or people coming from south of the border as rapists and drug dealers. It's that mentality, which in this play, the narrator has a line, it was the end of the world. They come from a land of mystery beyond the setting sun because they came from the West. Barbarians with hooked noses and like the monkey ribs.
Like the picture.
Like that. That's a Japanese interpretation of Commodore Perry. Our neighbor happens to be a lady who collects this form of art is called nanban, the Japanese perception of foreigners that came in from the mid-19th century on, and how they depicted Americans and the British and the French and the Dutch and the Russians. And so she has a collection, 60 of them. But that is how the Japanese perceived Commodore Perry with his hooked nose and having a slightly Japanese cast to his face. And so for me as a Japanese American with that experience of imprisonment behind barbed wires, that mentality again is what we have in this country. Next usually suggests looking forward, looking to the next thing. And we now look at what's on the horizon as something fierce. Yesterday's election gave us some solace to see Macron elected. But in this country, I think we're going backwards to that time when we were in prison simply because we looked like the enemy. So I think this story has a lot of resonance to our times.
Thank you.
I can add a point to that. It's a testament to John and Stephen Sondheim that their view of these events and the view of these individual cultures and their times and what happens when these cultures came together is so sophisticated and so complicated. The opening number, which deals with tradition and the peace and comfort that the Japanese find in honoring their tradition and replicating this their traditions in a cyclical fashion is an echo of tradition from Fiddler on the Roof. You know, it's a song about tradition, but it's a song about complacency. You know, and Sondheim, being a sophisticated student of the theater, understands that the opening number needs to communicate what the show is about, so, which he did by writing a special number early in previews for The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. He wrote Comedy Tonight. But this is about complacency tonight, you know, the opening number. And then we see over the course of the play, from that point to the point when we come to next, which we're talking about already, that Sondheim and John give form to the transformation in Japan. They give musical form to the transformation in form. The music transforms to the point where by the end, next is essentially an industrial show production number. Very American, done in American idiom, American vernacular language, driving pulse, very American. And that happens kind of in a slow dissolve over the course of the show. The early music is pentatonic. It evokes Japan. It has very little harmonic movement. We're talking about Chrysanthemum and Tea. One of the reasons I think I'm so personally fond of this is that it's the only show of Sondheim's that I can play on the piano. And it's because Chrysanthemum Tea has 2 chords over 6 minutes. It's, you know, but they're very effective. And so Sondheim is using the idiom, which is not based on harmonic movement, but rather on repetition. He's using the Asian idiom. Can I quote something that he said which is actually incorrect?
Absolutely.
Do you mind? This is from an interview that Sondheim gave about Pacific Overtures. He said, the main thing about it is that it is so deeply Japanese, as opposed to, say, The King and I or Madame Butterfly, which are merely Western treatments of Eastern subjects. I mean, let's face it, The King and I might just as well be about a teacher coming to teach in Brooklyn, except that she comes to Siam. What we're attempting to create in Pacific Overtures is a genuinely Oriental musical, but what he really did was something more sophisticated and more interesting, which was to employ Asian idioms, Asian ideas, and some Asian sonorities with some Asian instruments to evoke Asian instruments, but then to slowly show how the music can be transformed and how this culture was transformed by the usurping, the domination of Japan by the United States.
Let me ask John on that one, because that 1976, your view, George just gave us a view today, and the resonances. In 1976, when you wrote it, what were the resonances in your mind about the U.S.-Japan?
Well, you know, at the time, many people saw the piece as having been put on stage when the war in Vietnam was still a lively issue on the front pages of newspapers around the country. And it was often written about in reference to the war in Vietnam. That really was not part of the initial impulse behind the creation of the piece, except to the extent that all of us were living inside this ongoing horror show. So anything that you were writing, particularly anything that had to do with anything that involved the United States and Asia, was going to be colored by that. But you know, I think it's hard to recapture anything other than the essential authorial impulse, which was that because I had majored in East Asian studies, and because I was fascinated by modern Japanese history, and because that period in Japanese history had been kicked off by this, as you said, by this aggressive act on the part of the United States, that I knew something that most people didn't. and that there was a great story to tell, which would capture people's imaginations in a way that mine had been captured. And that if we could tell it well, different people would read different things into it. And we spent a lot of time, when the piece was being created, talking about what next would mean at the end of this story. What we wanted the audience to take away from it. Was it about the corruption of a pure culture? Was it about the price of progress? And there were some of the most interesting conversations among the three of us in terms of what we were trying to create. And I think one of the things that's happened to the show over the course of the productions that George has referred to is that different artists have filled the last part of the show with different information. When Amon Miyamoto did it at the New National Theatre in Tokyo, his first production in Japan, and that was the production that was brought over to the Lincoln Center Festival and done in Japanese. Miyamoto-san filled next with a walk through modern Japanese history that referenced Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that referenced the bubble economy exploding, that published the recovery from the, he filled it up with stage pictures which provided content, a particular kind of content to the song. What Doyle has done is essentially to strip away that kind of content and I think to let people, as I said, to let people hear the word and fill in their own feelings as to what it means when we are being propelled forward, as George said, in a way which either represents progress or regression. Is it good news? Is it bad news? It's a nice way to push the audience out of the theater and hopefully to lead to the kind of conversations you want to have over dinner afterwards.
So if I can add to that, I appreciate that you didn't have Vietnam overtly in mind.
Right.
But American imperialism was on all of our minds at the time. I was an undergraduate at the time of the original production. And I didn't have a draft card because I was an undergraduate.
Right.
The idea that American adventurism overseas, particularly in Asia, wasn't essentially missionary or evangelical or benevolent, but then had like a darker effect and maybe even a darker purpose was on all of our minds.
Yeah.
And coming out of the awareness that what Vietnam crystallized, and I think where we land at the end of Pacific Overtures is a feeling that the effect of this modernization is essentially one of profound loss, because we've seen over the evidence of the play the beauty of a culture that we're witnessing, sort of disappearing before our eyes as it's being replaced by sort of Americanism and Westernization. So we come away with this feeling of loss.
I do think one of the best songs Steve ever wrote, and maybe one of the best songs ever written for the musical theater, is Bowler Hat, which was sung in the second act of the show, when there were two acts. There's only one down at the classic stage. But that song addresses that issue very directly and with a brilliant lyric. And
it really is the whole play.
It is the whole play. You watch these, you start out with a Manjo who's been to the United States and is enamored of things American and a very traditional samurai. And in this number you see them basically trade places. And it's done through a series of specific, delicate images, so that the idea is delivered. In bits and pieces that add up to the sense of something which has been replaced, and it certainly feels like something that's been lost. On the point of American aggression, without question. I think one of the things that we all felt when we were writing the show and when we were thinking about what we were writing, by looking at this American event, 4 ships sent across the Pacific to open Japan, by looking at it from the other side, I think part of the story has to do with the kind of carelessness of American decisions at the time. The consequence of American ships needing coaling stations on their way to the China trade required someplace in between to stop and plus we could open up for a little. I mean, it was an almost casual decision which had a cataclysmic effect on the country which received it. And so that's certainly one of the ideas that I hope is alive in the show when people see, in particular when they see this production.
Well, I think what John Doyle's contributed to this production is to make it very Japanese. He's created theatrical haiku because, haiku, as you know, is taking just a suggestion, the essential idea, the scent on the soft breeze, the cherry blossoms, the poignance, because it ends too. That kind of reducing it down to the elemental and then finding the poetry to fill in the vacant space. And what he's done with the songs, for example, the opening song, float, in the middle of the world we float, he's with the almost no-like movement, this very ceremonial. It's a very Japanese, pure, elegant society that he's created, stripping everything away, and with movement and the words and the floating sensation. And the set too looks like it's floating. It's the dark base of the stage and the white parchment scrolled up. It's haiku, or because I was feeling my age when I heard the boy in the tree, someone in a tree, I have memories, but it's changed from my memories of when I was a child, and to poetically put that together just by suggestions. An old man and himself as a young boy, having witnessed that momentous event. And that event really didn't happen if that boy wasn't up there in the tree. It's the tree falling in the middle of the forest. The boy was there to witness the event. Just a fragment of the whole piece, but it existed. It's very haiku, a suggestion, and filling in with just a suggestion, the empty space. And that's throughout, with all the numbers. And for me as an Asian American, I particularly love the reverse situation of Please Hello. Because as actors, we have a history of having had to play heavily accented characters that are stereotypes and very caricatural. Well, here the Europeans are cartoons. Gilbert and Sullivan representative, or the Dutchman selling his chocolate and the wooden shoes, Gilbert and Sullivan Englishman, and they speak in pidgin English. And so the picture has been reversed. We're looking at Westerners as cartoon stereotypes speaking with pidgin English. So the music is really masterful, and they become very Japanese, or with Please Hello, a Japanese American view of
we can see in all these examples how Sondheim is carrying on some of the key lessons of his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein, who instilled in him that every song should have an idea, and that every song should have dramatic form. There should be a beginning and a middle and an end, and an arc to every song. The song should have things should start one way in the song and end another way in the song. One notable exception, and it's because the imperative to have structure flight against the imperative of an idea was the opening number, The Adventures of Floating in the Middle of the Sea, which has a repetitious cyclical quality which invokes the cyclical character of the society, and those, I actually have some of the lyrics. And my monotone reading of this does not disserve the material in this particular case. The farmer plants the rice. The priest exalts the rice. The Lord collects the rice. The merchant buys the rice. The craftsman makes the sword. He sells it to the Lord and buys it twice the former price. What he counts on his Lord to protect with his sword. Those naturally, Sondheim cannot avoid having a little cleverness in it, but we see that cyclical quality. And by the time we get to Someone in a Tree, which is one of my favorite Sondheim songs, we find the song that Sondheim himself has often said he considers his own favorite among his songs. And it's the most philosophical of the songs. It grows right out of George Barclay. And the idea that perception and experience, that reality is constructed by perception, that without perception there is no reality. So that's one of the ideas. If it happened, I was there, the song says. If it happened, I was there. What? It's right out of George Barclay. And then another idea in the same song is the idea that memory is constructed, in fact, history is constructed, the macro is constructed through the assemblage of details, that through the assemblage of the micro, we perceive an individual, subjective idea of the macro.
This is an example of why, if you're smart, you decide to collaborate with Stephen Sondheim as opposed to somebody else. I mean, I remember the meeting in which Hal and Steve and I were trying to figure out how to end the first act of the show, because in fact structurally it seemed obligatory to end with the delivery of the letter from President Fillmore. The Japanese have been resisting it. That's not going to work. They're going to come ashore and deliver the letter. But the delivery of a letter is not a particularly dramatic event. And in fact, that's all that happened. They basically came ashore and they said, Perry said, I'm going to be back in a year. Take your time, read it. But, it was very clear that when the Americans came back, there was a certain set of answers that they expected. So the question was, how do you take this non-event and essentially turn it into a moment that justifies bringing the curtain down at the end of the act? And we talked about, so sort of nothing happened, but what if somebody saw a piece of it, heard a piece of it, and I wrote sort of a 2-page scene, which was, in which I promise you, the ideas were expressed very directly, and I like to think somewhat artfully, but out of it came the song which has just been described, which is an astonishing sort of existential, philosophical expression about 17 different things that coalesce around this non-event. And I have to say, the song always makes me cry. And if you haven't seen the way it's performed down at the Classic Stage, it's worth the trip downtown just to hear Tom Sesma perform the part of the old man.
Master.
He used to make Sondheim cry too, the last line. And any historian in the room, it will make you cry too. Someone in a tree, I'm a fragment of the day. If I weren't, who's to say things would happen here that way? That they happened here. Only cups of tea and history and someone in a tree. And it's that last line, someone in a tree. So some of the things that you've been describing, you made me think that Hal Prince was very much inspired by kabuki. And I think you're right. The transition has been made from kabuki to no. I think that in this production, it is much more haiku-like and more no-like, and a lot more spaces and emptinesses, if you like, which in the Sondheim was described that he has these 3 principles, in addition to the Hammerstein ones, which is less is more, content dictates form, and God is in the details. And this particular version really does make those. First of all, less is definitely more in this case. The content does dictate the form, and as David said, there's a complete change from the first number to the last number, and that absolutely reflects what happened in Japanese history. Whether you think it was a good thing or a bad thing, when you get to next and that driving force, and there's a all these things that Japan does to modernize, and is who's the stronger, who's the faster, let the pupil be the master. I mean, you know, there's no question that this transformation in musical form reflects the history. And as for the details, all those details, the bowler hat, the spectacles, the monocle, all the things that reflect the westernization of the samurai. So I think you're right, from 1976 to 2017, there's been a transformation in the, if you like, the Japanese essence and aesthetic of the play. Still true, I think, to the history. So let me ask David, the music, I think you've described it very well in terms of the pentatonic. I mean, there's these Japanese elements, and it does shift. But Sondheim said over and over again, John knows this very well, that this was supposed to be a musical written by a Japanese who knew a lot about American theater.
Right. Right.
Although interestingly enough, Miyamoto Amon, who did that wonderful production in 2000 in Japan in Japanese, and then here in 2002 at Lincoln Center, he said that he'd seen Pacific Overtures on television, the original one, a tape of it, and he wasn't terribly interested in it because musicals in Japan meant Hello, Dolly, and Mame, and it wasn't, and he didn't do it until 2000. It's quite late, so that for Japanese sensibility, it wasn't really a musical that they were that in the way that they imagined it. So if it's a Japanese who knows a lot of American musicals writing the songs, how do you react to that in terms of the music?
I think that was a hook for him. I think it was a way for him to get started at the work. You know, he often described his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein, as not just a librettist, but a playwright, and among playwrights as an experimenter. So Sondheim thought of himself as an experimenter. And one of the ways that I think this play is often misunderstood is it's often characterized as an outlier in his canon. You know, it's political, it uses Asian motifs, it uses Asian themes, it's socio-political, it deals less with matters of the heart, more with matters of the mind and others. But it's really not so much an outlier, because what it has in common with every single one of his other plays is that it's very little like any of his other plays. I mean, each one of his plays is very little like all the rest of the plays. And here, I think by grabbing onto this, imagining and holding onto this conceit, it's a musical written by a Japanese man, came to America, saw some musicals, and then came back and wrote a musical. It was a way for him to retain being an experimenter, but elementally a man of the theater, which he is, like Hammerstein, is a man of the theater. And every one of the songs is a showbiz. It's a brilliant showbiz solution to a problem, and it's proudly, unapologetically showbiz at the same time that it's brilliant. You can take Please Hello as an example, which is a pastiche number, which shows how the Japanese were manipulated by 5 admirals who came from 5 countries to, coerce them, trick them, essentially con them into signing trade agreements. And he does it with 5 pastiches, which we talked about earlier, from musical theater idioms of the past. The Dutch admiral talks like someone out of a Weber and Fields routine from early vaudeville, and Gilbert and Sullivan. And the French number détente is like a French Chez Paris can number. And this conceit of this was written by a Japanese wanting to write a musical in a way that he could remain a man of the theater, which he was.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that. I mean, when I first approached Hal Prince with this idea of I was going to write a play, which became a musical, but it was going to be about Perry's expedition, or Perry's arrival in Japan. Out of the earliest conversations I had with Hal, and then Steve was added to them, we we arrived at the idea that the story to tell was not the story from the point of view of the Americans, but the important story to tell was from the point of view of the Japanese. And that was the genesis of the notion that we would assume the posture as authors of somebody who had come from Japan, seen a bunch of musicals, and gone back. I mean, it's a posture that you could comfortably assume in 1976. We were three white American guys, old Jews. Gershwin's didn't have any problem writing Porgy and Bess, and we didn't have any problem writing Pacific Overtures. But it was a deliberate decision to assume a particular point of view. And Steve's achievement, which, I mean, it's wonderful to hear you talk about it, because there's a level of nuance in the writing which you can hear if you have access to it. Now, I went to Japan after the show opened on Broadway, and I brought with me a bunch of cast albums, and I had hosts in various different places, and I would play them the score, and inevitably they were astonished at the fact that an American Broadway composer had created this musical landscape. And they were hearing something that I don't think they expected to hear, and that I would have trouble describing because I don't understand musical language well enough, but you have been. And I said it, it's a good idea if you're going to write for the musical theater to make Steve Sondheim your partner.
It allowed you to be cynical about America.
Yes.
Right? And that
Yes.
had to be essential.
Yes, no, that's correct. I mean, it did allow us to be cynical about America. It allowed us to be, when the show opened in 1976, it was done in New York, and it was wonderful to hear George talk about some of the actors I remember from that first production, Ernie Hirata and Yuki Shimoda and Alvin.
Yuki, right?
Yeah, and Alvin, who did the show again several times.
In Los Angeles.
Yeah, but I would be interviewed sometimes on the radio, and there was, in 76, there was often people would ask, well, how could you do a show about Japan and the United States and leave out Pearl Harbor? And I was like, well, wait a minute, the show's about Perry's expedition to Japan in 1853. And yes, the consequences, but I mean, was it really essential to reference Pearl Harbor or Nagasaki? We don't mention that. It was, at the time, the response to this decision, which didn't feel courageous, it just felt like that's what we wanted to write about. The response was a response to something which to many people felt, look, it opened at the Winter Garden Theater where Cats would play for 17 years, and then Mamma Mia would play for 17 years. And the idea now that a show like this would open at the Winter Garden Theater seems nuts. And it won't. It's playing in the right-sized house. But Hal and Steve did one adventurous show after another, and David's absolutely right. No two of them are alike, and they were all done in the commercial theater, and they were all done in houses that size. And the perspective and the point of view of the authors was not a lot like 42nd Street, which was playing across the street in a different theater. So it's been an interesting ride to see the way in which the show has evolved through not just a variety of productions, but to see the way in which audiences have grown around the show to embrace it in entirely different ways.
The singularly unique thing that John Doyle added to this production is females, 2 women. And when you hear the line, women being praised by a high-pitched soprano voice, that was shocking, because it was, every production has been all male because of the kabuki structure and men playing women. And so with women playing women, it was shocking to hear that female voice. And what he did was he added the young girl at the beginning, the observer, who participates in the story as well. And that made the husband and wife scenes so much more credible. And Tamate's suicide, so heartbreakingly poignant. So I think John Doyle is a genius for reducing everything to the essential and then adding that fresh, new idea, reimagining it, is making this production a landmark production, which you should all go and see.
One of the characters was changed too. The French admiral was changed to a French woman, a French ambassador for the.
Well, yeah.
She's the French admiral.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I ask you a question about back to the Pearl Harbor and the bomb?
yeah.
I was stunned to find when I read the original reviews of the Broadway production that so many critics made that criticism, which
Yeah.
seems like kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
But then why was the bomb in the Studio 54 introduced in the Studio 54 version?
That was, the Studio 54 version was Miyamoto-san's Japanese production, was done at the Lincoln Center Festival. Then the Roundabout invited him to do his production at Studio 54. And that, again, as I said, that was something which he decided to include as kind of a walk through modern Japanese history inside Next. So in that sense, it was a director's decision, which was an authorial decision. So he discussed it with us, but particularly that's what he did in Tokyo, and that's what he wanted to show a Japanese audience. And we loved the production, so he did it here as well. But that's where it came from.
It makes sense within Next. It makes
Yeah.
He actually explained it at, in 2004 when the Roundabout did that, and Miyamoto said, he said, I did this performance for Japanese. It's a post-2001 view, let's say post-9/11 view, which all the Japanese reviews of the Miyamoto performance in Tokyo mentioned. The Japanese are down, they're depressed, they have a recession now for a decade. I wanted to show them how they had picked up and rebuilt after the war. And the bomb, he said, that's what every Japanese would think. So if you're talking about U.S.-Japan relations and you're making a forced march through Japanese history in Next, he said, that just goes without saying. So it's a little bit like the flip side of the Pearl Harbor comment in 1976.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, my response to the Pearl Harbor question in 1976 was, well, we don't mention Nagasaki and Hiroshima either. So, you know, it seemed like it didn't seem like an odd question. The third time I was asked, I thought a lot of people are going to ask this. But, you know, we had the show opened out of town. We did it in Boston and in DC before it came to New York in '76. And, you know, '76 was still only 30 years separated from World War II, and there were a group of veterans, for example, who bought a block of tickets in Washington so that they could stand up and walk out, you know, 5 minutes into the show. And I find it hard to recover the world I was living inside of in 1976 as compared to the world, you know, the world we live inside of now. But it was a very different time in terms of how this show hit an audience, particularly a Broadway audience, but an American audience.
To do a show that's so cynical about America on the year of the bicentennial, when the great ships are floating up the Hudson, is staggering to think of. Really. I can't think of anybody other than you and Sondheim doing it.
You know, I've often said this, that, I mean, Hal Prince in many ways was the hand at the back of this production. Hal was sort of the hub of the wheel. When Steve and I wrote Assassins, we sort of went in a room, wrote the whole show, and came out when we were finished. But Hal was sort of the moving force behind this. And, you know, it's a tribute to his combination of his courage and his arrogance. I mean, arrogance in a nice way. That when I first talked to him about the material, I could see his eyes light up, because what immediately intrigued him was the possibility as a director of marrying this sort of vivid stage techniques of American musical theater with the vivid stage techniques of kabuki. And you guys, not you two guys go away and figure out what the story is. Well, I think about that. He was instrumental in all those conversations. But that was the notion of a commercial producer, because Hal produced his own show, deciding that was a smart thing to put on Broadway and a good way to make money, particularly with an all-Asian cast, with men playing women, because that was the kabuki tradition. And, you know, he did it. He just did it, because he could, he wanted to, and he's a very, very brave artist, and this show is a sort of a demonstration of that.
I'd say that that it's interesting, in 76, that's true about the American, 30 years since the war. In Japan, the reason this didn't appeal was because it actually seemed like it was a story they knew very well. See, I think that, it took a very long time and a lot of changes in Japan. This just didn't have much appeal or magnetism for Japanese. Only 30 years later, and when the whole Japanese-American relationship changed, when Japanese economy was in the doldrums, not on the rise, then all of a sudden the attraction was tremendous. They had very good reviews in Japan. So it changed on both sides of the Pacific, and the so-called Pacific Overtures. That's a quote from Commodore Perry. He in the letter that he wrote, he said that he expect Japan to respond to these reasonable and Pacific overtures, meaning reasonable and peaceful overtures. And then the next paragraph, he says, and if you don't, we're coming back with warships. Literally. So that kind of Japanese-American, I don't know, what can I say, this Japanese-American exchange of views about one another has been going on for more than 150 years, in a sense.
I'm curious about that last final image on stage.
Mm-hmm.
The gun that was introduced by Carol,
Mm-hmm.
and it remains on stage, and there's the red band of light on it. How did you interpret that?
Well, I think I follow what I interpreted as the American, because in Japan, gun stands for American. I don't know what it stands for Doyle, but in Japan, the swords are for Japanese and guns are for Americans. That was how the American occupation after the war. They thought that they abolished or they banned the sword play in movies, and they encouraged the guns because that was wholesome. Guns and kissing. Guns and kissing. So I interpreted it as the American, as what David said so eloquently about what happens next, where it's the Americanization or the Westernization of Kayama. That's what I think. Now, what was I supposed to think?
Well, I was intrigued because John Doyle plays with a lot of ideas, and in one of our technical rehearsals, it ended with a gun there and a red circular light on it, the flag of Japan, and it happened with 2 performances, and there were technicals, and that disturbed me. And so I went up to John and I said, if that's to represent Japan, that may have been relevant in the early part of the 20th century, from the beginning of the 20th century to up to the 40s, the warlike significance there. But today, Japan is not that. As a matter of fact, it's our strongest ally in the Pacific. And Japan is now dependent on the U.S. protection in times of war. And Japan's constitution is a pacifist constitution, although that's being, interestingly, just by pure coincidence, the Prime Minister's name, Abe, is the name of the shogun in the drama, and Abe is now trying to reconsider the pacifist clause in the Constitution. So to leave that image of Japan and the gun, I asked him, it's a little harsh, isn't it?
What did he say?
Well, he said, I want to try ideas, and that's what he does. He tries a lot of ideas and gets comments, or he sees how it works or not.
So I interpret it one way, you another. How did you see it?
Throw out for consideration a way to think about that.
Yeah.
We're led in the play to think about the rising commercialization and industrialization of Japan as meaning many different things. That's one of the ways that the play is so sophisticated. But among them is that this commercialization and industrialization is an act of vengeance against America. We're going to use your tools and outdo you.
But that's not Japan today.
No,
it's dependent on the U.S.
In the play. We pick that up in the play. It's, in fact, there's a line of dialogue, I think, about that, or a line of, I think, in the.
You have to remind
some of them. And so, if we see that industrialization and embrace of the commercial culture as a kind of weaponization, then the weapon becomes a symbol for that.
And I think, what happens now, George, is, because John and I talked about it, and yes, the gun is left on stage, and this rising sun flag becomes intense around it, but that then disappears, and we're left with a lighting effect, which is the stars and stripes.
Yeah.
And what I like about, again, it's a little bit like Miyamoto's making kind of his own decision about how do I fill in the last few minutes. What do I leave the audience with at the end of next? What it feels like to me is if you show up with guns, you don't know what's going to happen. If you take a gun out of a holster, it's out of the holster, and you don't know what's going to happen. The Americans arrive at the beginning of the story with guns, and there's a gun left on stage, and if you wanted to, you could get up on stage and pick it up at the end of the show. And to me, what's powerful about it is it makes to me it's a kind of an open-ended statement about the unresolved consequences of something that was done relatively carelessly in 1853. It's not about Japan.
But it's a single, the final image, acted next, so it remains. And perhaps with the red light and the white light suggesting the star and the stripes.
But to me, it feels as though, and I think John's intention was that we should feel as though there's a gun in the middle lying on top of the Japanese flag, and then that bleeds into a gun lying on top of the American flag, and then we're out.
John, do you see the commercial culture as a kind of violence?
I think that it's impossible. Well, the answer is yes. I think that and George, one of the things I like about this production, one of the things that drove some of the decisions about what we would cut and trim from the show, is that we really wanted, it's our version of it, we really wanted the audience to experience the delicacy of this intact culture. And this is, I'm making this statement without saying it's good, bad, or otherwise, but it had an intact quality to it, and a very specific, it seemed to me, tone and quality, which is then, you have to be careful what verb you use. You could say influenced, you could say corrupted, you could say undermined, you could say perverted by the arrival of what was essentially a commercial command from the United States. The ships arrived not because they were interested in Japanese culture. Japan was perceived as an additional way to help Americans make money. So that, as I said, the Americans needed coaling stations, they wanted to sell stuff. So it was ultimately, the business of America's business. It was Coolidge who said that. This was a kind of a government-sponsored business venture, and in that sense, I do think commercialism is perceived, is experienced as an act of violence perpetrated on a culture which had a particular quality which was not compatible with that.
So that's the way I would read it. And I was reading the gun symbolically. I would read the gun symbolically.
Yeah.
Well, they were gunboats, after all. Perry came with gunboats, and he shot off the cannon. All this was very orchestrated. He came with technological stuff too, like trains and telegraphs and things. He was going to show the power of the United States. So the gun, the trade at the barrel of a gun was the message, right? And that's why I take the original next that says, learn the lesson from the master, do it nicer, do it faster, as a response. So that's how I think the gun is there. It was not a peaceable, it was not a Pacific overture, was never meant to be, and the Japanese understood it that way and felt that if they didn't modernize, do it nicer, do it faster, they would lose their sovereignty, and so it was a race from their point of view for national survival. And commerce, which all of the American presidents that had anything to do with Japan from already from 1841 on, they all said that not to trade was a hostile act. And in the letter of Perry, he said the sacred duty to, I mean, you know, that was, commerce was a sacred duty from the United States at the point of a gun. So I think that there is certainly, as historically, there's good reason for interpreting that way. I'd like to spend the last few minutes with questions from the audience, if you have any. If you would stand up and scream, it would be good. We can hear you.
Well,
Sorry, I can't hear.
you mentioned Chrysanthemum Tea as being your favorite song. When you first heard it, how do you feel about it not being included?
Well, we get done with the work in 90 minutes. We get to go home.
It's one of my favorite songs too. So.
It is. It's a lovely song, but it does go on and on and on.
Let me speak to, let me speak to that point as well. I mean, you know, one of the things that was true of the show originally was that fundamentally it's a story of these two men who change places in bowler hat, and then one of them kills the other at the end of the show. I'm sorry?
Now it is.
Now, that's what, precisely. By extracting material from the show which interrupted the story of these two men, Steve and I have always felt as though we were strengthening the story of these two guys, and that fundamentally that's where the show wanted to live. Chrysanthemum Tea is, I mean, you know, the cleverness of it is.
Tell them what it does. Tell them the story quickly.
Well, it's, I mean, well, I'll tell you where it falls in the story, and it's part of the reason why it was taken out. I mean, Kayama and Manjiro have been out to the American ships and told them they have to leave. They said, we're not going anywhere. We then come back to the reciter who introduces at long last the Shogun, and there is this long song in which we discover that the Shogun is kind of a nitwit, and that his kind of Jewish mother is poisoning him, because if there's no Shogun to receive the letter, then the Americans will logically have to just leave, because the mailbox they're supposed to put the letter in doesn't exist anymore. And then we went back to the story of the two guys who were now in hot water for having failed. And it felt as if, let's see what happens if we take the number out and just stay with the story of these two guys. Does it strengthen the fundamental experience of the show? And I think it does. I think this song is breathtaking, but I think we actually, the overall experience of Pacific Overtures is stronger without it.
Another testament to what a great man of the theater Sondheim is, because he had the sense to agree to cut that boy Ken Foxtrot from Follies, which the word foxtrot meant another word that begins with F, and replaced it with "I'm still here." And that boy Ken Foxtrot is a killer. It was a showstopper, and that was the problem.
Yeah,
it stopped the show.
Yeah.
So he had the sense this slowed down, this conception of the show has to go.
Yeah, and almost every decision that reduced the length of the show was driven by that same impulse in this production. It was let's stay with what John Doyle refers to as the lads, Manjiro and Kayama. To the extent that we can, we'll take sort of detours into Welcome to Kanagawa and other places as well, but let's stay on the story of what happens to these two guys, because what happens to these two guys culturally as they change places really tells the story of the show.
And as a historian, I will say I love Chrysanthemum Tea, but the Shogun wasn't poisoned, so I had a little trouble with that.
But also, I'll just speak to that really quickly. Steve is justifiably really proud of the fact that Please Hello, which is the five Western powers showing one after the other, is historically accurate. They showed up in that order. The demands they made are specifically articulated by each of the admirals. He actually explains what extraterritoriality is, and that's what the Russians asked for. I mean, and he loves the fact that this is the way it happened, and I put it in the song. Chrysanthemum Tea is a song about, as I said, a nitwit shogun who strangled his father and is being poisoned by his mother. That's not quite so historically accurate. So but it's a reflection of who we were when we were writing the show. That it seemed, you know, if I'd said, hey, Stu, why don't you add an Australian admiral because the accent will be funny? He would have said, no, I'm going to stick with the history book. Not such a compulsion when we were dealing with the Japanese side of the story.
You'll never hear a lyric with extraterritoriality in it. I mean, it's really an amazing lyric, right?
And the actor that sings it is absolutely a standout.
Oh, the performances are fabulous.
I mean, amazing lyrics and very accurate. They explain most favored nation clause. They explain everything that you know in these lyrics. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. First, one comment. One comment about the sentiment. I agree with everybody. It's a great song, but I think it's the least Japanese song of the show. As you say, she's a Jewish mother.
It's a Jewish mother song.
It's very Western. Not very, but relative to the other songs, it's pretty Western musically. The narrative of it is a bit Broadway, traditional Broadway in a sense. I wanted to ask, I'm doing my PhD in musicology right now, and I'm writing Pacific Overtures, and I find it very interesting how Said's ideas in Orientalism resonate through the show, as if the show was written as kind of a response to that, but the book came out two years after the show opened. So, the same comment.
Which book?
Orientalism.
Orientalism by Said.
Yeah, by Said. I don't have anything useful to say. I mean, I read the book way back when. Oddly, since I was coming out of my own academic place in creating the show, I was interested in what other academics had to say about this large umbrella area that we were operating inside of, but I don't remember having a particular feeling about the relationship between the show and the book. It's not a helpful answer, I'm sorry.
Another question? Okay. All right, well, just a word on the Orientalism from my point of view. When Sondheim, Orientalism meant something different in the 1970s, before Said, which is before.
Yeah.
And when Sondheim said Orientalism then, he was actually thinking of it in a positive way in terms of the music, and the last thing he was thinking of it as the stereotypes or whatever. That's why he reversed so it's only the foreigners who speak pidgin. Yeah. So I think that's another interesting thought. If that were happening today, I don't think Stephen Sondheim would even use that word.
No, he wouldn't.
See, so it's another shift in the times that is reflected here. What's amazing about this particular show, and this is actually true of most of Sondheim, you keep saying yes. I mean, I just think it's wonderful to be alive in the age of Sondheim, much less collaborate with him. But this show, this Pacific Overtures has really weathered, and I think it's weathered lots of changes in the times on both sides of the Pacific, and I think it's because Stephen Sondheim is obviously an amazing lyricist and theatrical artist, but I also think it has to do a lot with the book and the fact that it is as true to history as it is. I mean, that's one reason why I have always championed this show, because it is someone in a tree. It really is a cup of tea on history, and somehow that seems to carry. And I think the story, the two men, without knowing, just the fact that one of them was westernized, one of them wasn't, that's enough. And that becomes almost a universal story, even though it's very specific history. So it's now 40 years plus, and it doesn't feel Orientalist, and it doesn't feel particularly Japanese American. It feels like a tremendous work of theater, which is carried by this story.
And very Japanese.
And very Japanese,
In this
which is
version.
respect, which is actually in the original, I think. That respect was in the original. Because I think in those days, kabuki probably seemed respectful. It's a different theatrical sort of sensibility. Well, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Donald Keene Center and our very generous anonymous donor. And I want to thank, don't laugh, it's very important, David and John and George for participating. And I don't think you will ever hear quite as much of the innards of this particular show, or indeed of musical theater as we've heard today. So thank you very much, and thank you to